Oh, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining this session. The session is titled "A New," quotes around that New Deal, and a quotes around new, a lot of news here, new global economy. Can it work? That's can the New Deal and a new global economy work? You'll see what the title means as we move forward. The session title really is a question to be assessed by the panel. It is not a given, but a launch point in history, 1 year after the inauguration of a new president, a new administration, and appointments far different from the previous administration, promising in its initial year far-reaching changes and effectiveness in the business of the central, that is federal government in our society. The new president and administration replaces the previous with essentially the same Congress and leadership in a country that is the United States, beset by external shocks, particularly COVID-19 in early 2020 and the pandemic that it has become, now in its fifth wave of surge, non-economic and unprecedented in origin as far as external shocks go, that I and others have studied. Global in its sweep, which makes it unusual, except for the oil price shocks of the 70s. Economic and societal waves of change and turmoil as a consequence, including the business cycle, subjected to the illness. And arguably, at this time, the biggest wave of technological change, I say arguably, the biggest wave of technological change and innovations ever, deep-seated political divisiveness in the United States, egregiously obvious inequality in the United States, change and changing geopolitics and shifting sands in the world. This is today. This situation and the new administration approach, initiatives, and programs, the 2020 collapse of the US and global economies in response to the pandemic and its aftermath, and particularly the shift in policies of the United States to federal government-centric, is reminiscent of the 1930s New Deal and its many crises, the many crises of that time, the 1960s Great Society, at least on the expenditure side of these programs. And it's very different nature from the Reaganomics and the Reagan years and Thatcherism of the 1980s. Though there were huge fiscal deficits then, it's just that the whole approach of, as we know, Reagan and what that ushered in and Thatcherism was away from central government to the private sector. Very different from the thrust of the Biden administration. The size and impact of the federal government underscored by a cumulative $7 trillion, 5 programs over the last 2 years, deficit finance, fiscal support, and stimulus, this assumes no build back better until after the midterms. The human infrastructure, transformational, fiscal 1930s-like program, I would argue, is without precedent. This amount is without precedent in modern times, I think ever, as a percent of GDP, worthy of examination, discussion, debate by today's panel, and I hope others to come. The New Deal dimensions, the crisis, recovering from the COVID-19 shutdown, induced shutdown, total shutdown of the US economy, and then living with the pandemic in the economy and world at large. The economy and getting to full employment is reminiscent of the New Deal of the 1930s. As we now know, that didn't happen until World War II. Infrastructure, traditional infrastructure in a bill recently signed, supported by both houses of Congress. And then infrastructure, the human, societal, and transformative 1930s like human infrastructure still out there, not yet determined. And then a tremendously long list of societal issues, also economic, climate change, inequality, income, wealth, education, health, all of that, egregious inequality in the United States, childcare, family leave, all of the matters that are touched by the Build Back Better program. I think we're assuming as a forecast matter, it will not be passed before until after the midterms. And then the new technology, its effect, and political and geopolitical, like the 1930s. I hope no big conflicts military with China, but that is an open question. Mainly the long-run competition of two capitalistic models, that of China and the United States, and the attention of the Biden administration to this long-run issue is reminiscent of the New Deal of the 30s. New Deal and the New World economy. Can we work through this? It's worthy for the distinguished academically based scientists, panelists that we have, but they're not just scientists. They're all experienced in politics, having served in various administrations and in advisory capacities to politicians for decades. The political views of the panelists are diverse. Two normally are thought of as Democratic Party. That's Alan and Karen. One, the Republican side, I think on Greg's website now, he declares himself to be independent. And Branko, whose politics I do not know. He's a globalist specialist on China and inequality. For me, I'm politically independent, have been for decades, because I always thought that would bias the scientific work that I do and the forecasting work that I do. But I've had the pleasure and honor of serving politicians on both sides, presidential administrations, Federal Reserve, and lots of meetings, testimony for Congress. So I do know Washington. I never really wanted to work there. I'm a 30,000 foot independent objective advisor with societal views, I confess, are liberal, but economic views that tend to be, based on my research, conservative. The structure of the program is 12 to 15 minutes each for opening remarks. The titles are in the program of each. The order: Alan, Greg, Karen, and Branko. I think questions, comments, the AV technician, I believe we do that on chat. And then we will open up after those comments. I may have a few provocative comments to make on what the panelists say, but they and you will be free to range over all topics and those that we don't touch on with any questions, comments. So we have a discussion and open it up to all of these issues that I think all of us think are so vital to our economy and our society. So we really start with Alan Blinder. He, in terms of policy, advising politicians wisely for decades, serving as a member of the Council of Economic Advisors in President Clinton's administration, and at the Federal Reserve, 1994 to 1996 as vice chairman, for a very good friend and colleague of mine for decades, who, Alan, I think I saw maybe more times than you did, 88 one-on-one meetings with Chair Greenspan. But we didn't always talk about economics. We fought about whose forecasts were better. That's what we debated. Anyway, Alan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alan. And I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Let's see. All right, that worked, right?
Yep.
Okay. I almost said good morning. Good afternoon, everybody. Alan was talking about the 1930s quite a bit. As he did that, it struck me that the Fed made vast changes in 1935 as part of the New Deal, more or less. But those changes were about Fed governance and the processes by which decisions would be made. The changes I'm going to talk about today, the August 2020 changes, are really about the Fed's objectives and methods for pursuing those objectives, not at all about the governance. The governance of the Fed is exactly the same today as it was on August 26th, 2020. And I want to start knowing that this is the ASSA meeting, not the NBER monetary group, so that not everybody dotes on the Fed. Everybody that's on this webinar, many of you do, but not everybody do. So I have two preliminary remarks aimed especially at the non-doters, which is not an insult, by the way. There's lots of other things you could be doting on besides the Fed. The first, as it says here, is bigness is in the eye of the beholder. To people like me and to Greg and to Karen that pay rapt attention to the Federal Reserve, what happened in August was a very, very big deal. It may not, as I go over what happened in August, it may not seem that way to a lot of you who don't follow the Fed closely, but by the stodgy standards of the Federal Reserve, these were very major changes. And I'm going to say in about a minute what they were. Secondly, again, those who follow the Fed at all know that the Fed has in law what's called a dual mandate to pursue maximum employment and stable prices. Those are the exact phrases that are in the law. And as of course you can tell, each one is subject to interpretation. The status quo ante before the changes of last August were thought of by economists anyway, as it shows on the slide. That is, the maximum employment objective was typically modeled as minimizing the gap between the unemployment rate and the natural unemployment rate, or neutral or full employment or equilibrium, or whatever adjective you want to use. Or you could have substituted Y's for U's and talked about the GDP gap, more or less the same thing. The point is, of course, that U star, the natural rate of unemployment, has to be estimated. And there's no reason on earth to think that it's not changing over time. And so the Federal Reserve is constantly estimating and changing its often changing its estimate of the natural rate. And in recent years, that estimate has been coming down, 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 down. Probably lagging reality. This goes back to stodginess. Stable prices is different, qualitatively different, in that we do believe that at least in the long run, the central bank can determine, quote unquote, or at least heavily influence the rate of inflation. So as it says in parentheses there, this is chosen by the Federal Open Market Committee as opposed to the natural rate, which it cannot choose. And since 2012, the Fed has been specific in defining the target rate of inflation as 2% measured by the deflator for personal consumer expenditures, not the CPI that gets the most attention in the media. And an important footnote, which we really didn't used to make, but now have to make because of the changes, which I'm coming to now, is that bygones were bygones. That meant the price level could drift away from what you thought it was a decade, what it was going to be a decade before, if inflation is running constantly below 2% or constantly above 2%. In the instant of August 2020, it had been running constantly below 2%. So let's talk briefly about the situation when these changes were promulgated. As I just said, inflation had been running below 2% pretty much continuously since the 2% objective was announced. with the estimated neutral real interest rate and the inflation rate as low as they were, the Fed was worried about the effect of lower bound on interest rates, something that 2 decades ago we thought was an intellectual curiosum of no great importance, but we've come to realize is not that at all, and is something the Fed concluded well before August 2020 that this is something it would have to worry about frequently in the coming years. In terms of output and employment, of course, the palindromic quarter, 2022, second quarter, was the disaster quarter. The GDP had cratered, the unemployment rate had soared, and I'm trying to see if, yeah, and I put no one in quote because I'm sure there was somebody in the forest of Montana who thought differently, but nobody saw 2020 third quarter coming the way it came. We had a 30% plus annualized growth rate. Remember, this was August 2020. That was during the third quarter. So that was not history yet. The horrible events of second quarter of 2000 were history. So that was the backdrop when the Fed dropped this announcement at the end of August. And there were 4 big changes. I list them here, and the next 4 slides are gonna go 1, 2, 3, 4 on each of them. First of all, it moved from targeting inflation to be 2% per annum whenever it could to what they call flexible average inflation targeting. I'll come back to all of those words, but you don't do great injustice to the idea to think of it as price level targeting. So 2% per annum, the price level should go up 2% per annum over a long period of time, whatever that means. Second, the Fed had long been practicing what's called the preemptive approach to fighting inflation, which is when you saw bad signals of inflation on the way, such as a very low unemployment rate, you would raise interest rates to head off the inflation rate before it happened. And the Fed had done that successfully a couple of times. That was abandoned in August 20 in favor of what I like to call the Bunker Hill strategy. And what I mean by that is you don't fire until you see the whites of inflation's eyes. So the Fed now has the attitude, okay, when we see inflation, now you're thinking we are seeing inflation, and I'm coming back to that. When we see inflation, we raise interest rates to fight inflation, but we don't raise interest rates preemptively because we think inflation might be coming our way. Third, that symmetric loss function that I mentioned a couple of slides ago was changed to an asymmetric loss function by dint of the Fed saying it was very worried about unemployment being above the natural rate, but not so worried about unemployment being below the natural rate. And then just in general, if you think of the dual mandate and the weights on those 2 objectives in the kind of loss function economic models usually use, there was a clear movement towards the employment objective and away from the inflation objective. So let me take these one at a time. The most obvious thing about flexible inflation targeting instead of inflation targeting is that bygones are no longer bygones. And when, for example, the inflation rate has been below 2%, you could change that to above 2% for a long time, the Fed owed us some kind of catch-up, pushing inflation. Let's just stick to 1. If inflation had been below 2% for a long time, the Fed would then be pledged to push it above 2%, at least for a while. And that was the case in August 2020. It may not be the case now. The intellectual idea behind this is that what you're trying to do is raise the expected rate of inflation when your problem is that actual inflation is very low, and therefore you're having trouble driving real rates as low as you want them to be. The Fed, to make that really work, you have to say something about the averaging period, and the Fed didn't. This was one of the criticisms that I and many other people leveled at the Fed back in August when they announced this. Average over what period? 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 20 years. And as it says here, they still have not specified that. We'll come back to that point. Secondly, instead of preemptive fighting of inflation, the Bunker Hill strategy, they used to make forecasts based on, I put this in quotes, a Phillips curve. It doesn't have to be a literal Phillips curve, but some kind of quantitative equation or equations that gave them estimates of future inflation. By August 2020, the Fed was sick and tired of its own bad forecasts, and others also. I should say it wasn't only the Fed that was bad at forecasting inflation, but it included the Fed. These forecasts based on Phillips curves had been failing miserably for a decade or more. And so they decided, as I said, to wait to see inflation going up rather than act preemptively. An important point not emphasized by the Fed, but a very important point, is that implies that the Federal Market Committee is always going to be behind the curve. Journalists ask me all the time, is the Fed going to be behind the curve? And I said, of course. That's their new policy, is to be behind the curve in either direction, whether the inflation rate's going up, which it is now, or going down. It's built into the new policy procedures to always be behind the curve. Third, the attitude towards the loss function is no longer symmetric, as I said, is concentrating on shortfalls of employment rather than what they used to say is deviations of employment from full employment. And the Fed really emphasized this point. This is where you had to be an aficionado of the Fed. If you read the Fed's kind of boring prose, which it always tries to be, you don't really appreciate, it was putting 17 exclamation points, figuratively speaking, on the sentence in the statement that it made. Like, don't miss this point. This is important. And finally, I put on the title, a systematically more dovish Fed, the traditional hawk-dove etymology is that the hawks care more about inflation, the doves care more about unemployment. The Fed did not declare itself more dovish, but if you look back at the 3 slides we just went over, and what does that all mean? It clearly means much more emphasis on unemployment, inflation, which since behind and it's other things, it's too high for a while. Okay, those are the 4. Now wait, there was a 5th one. If you ask the Fed, it was important. They said, and they still say, this is a quote, maximum employment is a broad-based and inclusive goal. I've always wondered what that actually means. In some sense, I know what it means because they've talked about the plight of low-wage people, of minority, the minorities in a population that tend to have higher unemployment rates than other groups and things like that. That's what it means. But I've always had a question of what in the world would you do if you wanted to operationalize that, if you were on the Fed? And I think the answer to this question that I posed in the last bullet on the screen is the Fed really doesn't have any instruments it can use towards that end. When I've talked to journalists about this upteen times, I've always said the one really, really important thing the Fed can do for these minority groups is to run the labor market hot, very hot. And that's what I still think. But the Fed does have this, keeps repeating that it cares about more than just the unemployment rate, but a broad-based and inclusive view of the labor market. I'm almost finished. I just want to finish by asking how these changes look now from the perspective of today, with the important caveat that these are only about 4 months old. So we happen to be having this session today, but it's way, way too early to make a judgment on how these new procedures will work. As far as flexible average inflation targeting goes, I think the absence of a stated averaging period threatens to cut expected inflation adrift, which is not what you want. On the other hand, the good news is if you look at financial markets, it doesn't seem to have moved up very much. It has moved up, the expected rate of inflation, but not hugely. The Bunker Hill strategy instead of the preemptive strategy was going to be, that was completely predictable, that the Fed would be behind the curve, and it's way behind the curve right now. Here's a picture of the inflation rate that the Fed targets, the core PCE inflation. The red is the 2% line, and we're sitting now at 4.7%. And you can see what the history was going into the episode. Thirdly, what about the caring about shortfalls rather than deviations in employment? That really hasn't been an issue yet, but it may be starting to be an issue now. The last measurement that just came out was a 3.9% unemployment rate, as probably a lot of you know. And finally, the generically more dovish Fed was clearly a good thing between the summer of 2020 and now, but there's a question of whether it's such a great thing in the near-term future. So the bottom line is, if you lean dovish, the August 20 changes look like a good thing. If you lean hawkish, maybe not so much. And it'll take some time to know if we have a, quote, permanently, unquote, more dovish Federal Reserve. Thanks very much.
Alan, thanks. And Greg, implicit in what you said, Alan, I think the possibility that interest rates may go even higher than anybody thinks, which is, I think, relevant to what Greg might be talking about. Greg,
thank you. I assume you all can see my screen.
Yes.
I'm going to talk about a very different set of issues. I'm going to think more about fiscal policy and financing of government debt. So I think we've also seen a lot of pretty big changes in how people are thinking about that over the past few years. If you look at the ratio of government debt, this is debt held by the public as a share of potential GDP, and this is potential GDP as measured by the CBO, it's now about 100%, which is just below the historical peak, which was reached at the end of World War II. And if you believe CBO projections, the debt GDP ratio is not likely to come down quickly in the years to come, and as it did after World War II. And indeed, it might even rise further as more baby boomers retire and become eligible for Social Security and Medicare. So if you look at this picture, you might think that the government debt is a serious problem. On the other hand, if you multiply this series, the debt GDP ratio, by some measure of interest rates to get a rough measure of the cost of debt service, this doesn't look problematic at all. This is nominal debt service. I'm using nominal interest rates here. And so nominal debt service as a percentage of potential GDP is now at half the level that prevailed from 85 to 95. And if in addition you subtract some measure of core inflation to get some real measure of debt service, you find an even more dramatic decline. From this perspective, the current level of government debt seems extremely manageable. Now, the reason, of course, for this discrepancy between looking at the debt to GDP ratio and the cost of debt service is that we've had a very big decline in real interest rates over this period. And this is true in the United States, which is what I'm looking at, but it's true of a lot of nations around the world. In the late 80s and 1990s, the real interest rate was typically between 4 and 5%. In the 2010s, it was typically below 1%. And during the pandemic of the past couple of years, interest rates have even dipped below zero. And as we're talking today, the rate on the 30-year tip is about negative 44 basis points. So this raises a variety of questions, which I want to try to take up today. And the questions are, first, should we no longer worry about government debt when we face such low interest rates? And one of the reasons we traditionally worry about government debt is we worry that government debt crowds out capital. And so you might ask the question, okay, is government crowding out of capital not a problem when interest rates are so low? A related question is, can the government run huge deficits and just roll over the debt and accumulating interest forever? That's sort of running a Ponzi scheme. And if it can do this, should it? what are the welfare implications of just issuing a lot of debt and just trying to roll it over forever? But before I think these are broadly normative questions. But before we turn to the normative questions, I think we need to at least quickly address the positive questions, which is why are interest rates so low in the first place? So what I'm going to do is first address this positive question, and then I'm going to try to turn to some of these normative questions and some of my thinking about that. Okay, when thinking about the equilibrium interest rate, and since this is a long-term decline, I'm thinking about this as really as in terms of equilibrium full employment interest rates. The place to start is the supply and demand for loanable funds, which this is a diagram coming from one of my favorite textbooks, and I'm sorry, Alan, it's not yours. So it hits you in terms, you can think of this as sort of savings and investment. And so I want to offer sort of 6 hypotheses about what's going on to savings and investment that might be driving down the equilibrium real interest rate. Okay, so the first 3 hypotheses have to do with the supply of loanable funds, or the savings side. First, as income inequality has risen over the past few decades, resources have shifted from poorer to richer households. And if the rich have higher marginal propensities to consume, that's going to tend to increase saving rates. Secondly, the Chinese economy has grown rapidly in recent years, and China has a high saving rate. And this new vast pool of saving flows into capital markets around the world. This is something that I think Ben Bernanke emphasized when he was Fed chair, what he called it the savings glut. And finally, we've had some pretty dramatic events in the past couple decades. The financial crisis of 2008, the pandemic of 2020, and they're pretty vivid reminders of how uncertain life can be. And if people have responded to these events by increasing their precautionary saving, that would also tend to drive down equilibrium interest rates. The next 3 hypotheses are on the investment side of the equation, things that might have shifted the downward the demand for loanable funds. The first is that we may be in an era of slower technological change, and economic growth has slowed. And some economists attribute this to just slower technological progress. And here I'm thinking particularly of Bob Gordon's work. And a decline in that kind of growth might reduce the demand for new capital investments. Secondly, to the extent that we're having technological change, they may be of a different nature. New technologies like those developed in Silicon Valley may require less capital than the older technologies like railroads and auto factories. And as a result, the demand for capital may be down. And finally, and this is what I'm going to emphasize a lot in this talk, is some economists have suggested that the US economy is less competitive than it once was. And one thing that's not fully appreciated is that businesses with greater market power, they not only charge prices above marginal costs, which is the standard thing we teach in Econ 101, but they also tend to invest less. And I'm going to turn, I'll get back to that in just a question, because I think that might actually be quite important. Now, I have no idea which of these 6 hypotheses is right. Very likely, it's a combination of forces are at work. But I think we need to at least think about, before we think about the implications, we need to think about what are the forces that are driving down equilibrium interest rates. Okay, so what are the implications of these forces? Well, I think one implication is that endowment returns are going to be lower. And I'm on some nonprofit boards, and I've been trying to emphasize this to them. You know, over the past century, a balanced portfolio of half stocks and half bonds has earned an average real return of about 5%. Looking ahead, it's hard to imagine that's going to be true going forward. I mean, even I think optimistically, I think a 3% real return is more likely over the next 20 or 30 years. And I won't be surprised if it's even a bit below that. What that means is that institutions that rely on their endowments, universities, for example, are going to need to tighten their belts. It also means that individuals will need to rethink retirement savings. To support any level of retirement, you need a much bigger nest egg if the future real return is 3% than if it's 5%. And it's much the same reason pension funds that are already we know are underfunded under conventional assumptions are probably even more underfunded than the standard estimates suggest. Of course, this is not unambiguously a bad thing. Young families looking to buy homes, for example, are the are the beneficiaries of low interest rates. The way to think about it is interest rate is just a price, and when price changes, there are people on different sides of the market, and some people are going to gain, and some people are going to lose. So I don't think there are any clear welfare implications. What I would like to do now is talk about the implications of all this for fiscal policy. In particular, I want to talk about whether governments can run Ponzi schemes. That is, it's very tempting to think of basic increased government spending, and this gets back to the New Deal that Alan started this program talking about. It's very tempting to think of increased government programs as a free lunch. The government can finance its spending with new debt, roll over the debt and the interest that's accumulating on that debt forever, and never have to raise taxes. In other words, it can fund new programs with a successful Ponzi scheme. Now, that sounds a little crazy to some people, but it's actually not as crazy an idea as it might sound. And you don't have to go all the way to modern monetary theory to think it's crazy. You can sort of find these kind of results even in standard neoclassical growth models. So if you go to, say, a diamond overlapping generations model, the economy can find itself in an equilibrium with interest rate below the growth rate. Diamond showed this back in the 1960s. In this case, the savings desires of the young are so strong that they push the economy beyond what Ned Phelps called the golden rule level, a condition that's sometimes called dynamic inefficiency. So if you find yourself in that Diamond Phelps equilibrium with interest rates below the growth rate, you can issue government debt and run a Ponzi scheme. It does create out capital, but creating out capital is a good outcome in that case because you have too much capital. You're solving the problem of overaccumulation by crowding out capital. Indeed, you can lead to a Pareto improvement where everybody benefits. Current generations benefit because they get the benefit of the programs that the debt is financing, and future generations benefit because they're born into a economy with less capital, which is not productive because we're above the golden rule. And so therefore, they benefit as well. So you can lead a Pareto improvement across all generations if you happen to find yourself in this dynamic and efficient economy. And I think some of the discussion of how we don't need to worry about debt is implicitly assuming that we happen to find ourselves in this Diamond Phelps inefficient equilibrium. Now, I'm very skeptical that this is the right description of the circumstances we now face. One reason is that growth in the economy is risky. In the world with uncertainty, comparing a safe interest rate with a risky growth rate to judge dynamic efficiency is problematic. And I explored this issue some years ago in papers with two papers, one with Andy Abel, Larry Summers, and Dick Zeckhauser, and another with Larry Ball and Doug Elmendorf. And I'll refer you to those papers. I'm not going to talk about those papers today, but in a world of uncertainty, you got to be very careful when you have an uncertain growth rate and a certain real interest rate to compare them and evaluate anything about dynamic efficiency. But what I do want to talk about in my last couple of minutes is the work I've been doing with Larry Ball. And what we've been doing in a recent paper is looking at the implications of increased market power and how that is going to impact the analysis of fiscal policy. And we were motivated by this, by recent work, and there's a variety of papers on this. Here's just one of them. There's a variety of papers now that have suggested that over the past several decades, markups have gone up substantially. So we're in a much less competitive economy than we used to be. There's debate whether this is due to antitrust policy not being sufficiently robust. I think it's probably more due to technology, that technological change. We're moving more towards industries that have a lot of market power. Think of Facebook, for example. But whatever it is, but there's an accumulating body of evidence, controversial for sure, but accumulating body of evidence that we're less competitive than we have been in the past. And what Larry Ball and I have been doing in our recent work is trying to analyze the implications of this increased markups for thinking about fiscal policy. Often people look at these markups and think, oh, this is an issue about industrial organization and antitrust policy, but I think it really has macroeconomic implications as well. And one of the reasons it does is that people often neglect the following fact, which I think is well established in the literature, but often kind of overlooked, which is that firms with market power not only charge prices above marginal cost, but also choose a capital stock such that the marginal product of capital exceeds the cost of capital. Now, that's not completely obvious, but it follows from very, very simple algebra. So let me do that for you. Firms with market power, they charge price above marginal cost. So mu here is the markup. But what is marginal cost? Well, there's different, marginal cost can be measured in different ways. It can be measured as a function of the cost of a factor and the marginal product of that factor. And one of those factors is capital. So one way to write marginal cost is as the cost of capital divided by the marginal product of capital. This, of course, there's also the wage divided by the marginal product of labor. That's going to be less important for what I'm saying here. One metric for marginal cost is the cost of capital R divided by its marginal product. Well, if you just take these two equations and stick them together, you get this third equation that says the marginal product of capital is equal to mu times the real cost of capital. And so just as the markup mu puts a wedge between the price of capital and the marginal the price of output and the marginal cost of output, it also puts a wedge between the marginal product of capital and the cost of capital. And what this means is that in this environment, the real interest rate, while it reflects the cost of capital, R over P, it does not reflect the marginal product of capital, MPK. And what Ball and I show, basically expanding both the Solow model and the Diamond overlapping generations model, we show that it's possible for market power to depress real interest rates, making a perpetual rollover of government debt feasible. But unlike under competition, the increase in debt does not yield a Pareto improvement. Instead, the government debt crowds out capital, which at the margin remains valuable. In other words, the introduction of market power into an otherwise conventional neoclassical growth model breaks the link between the feasibility and desirability of government Ponzi schemes. The bottom line is that low real interest rates may make increased government borrowing attractive to policymakers who are focused only on budgetary costs, that it's going to drive the real interest rate down, and from a budgetary standpoint makes debt very cheap. But it would be a mistake to conclude that from the low budgetary cost, that the macroeconomic implications of higher government debt are benign. That is, even in an environment with low interest rates, in even an environment where you can roll over debt forever and you don't have to worry about the budgetary cost, government debt can still reduce social welfare by crowding out capital. And that's one of the reasons why, I don't know for sure how important these effects are. This is still very speculative, but to the extent that we are in an environment with more market power, which a lot of the research suggests, then crowding out of capital is probably a bigger problem than people might think. And looking at low interest rates as a sign that we don't need to worry about the cost of capital anymore, we don't need to worry about crowding out, is a mistake. And so that's why I'm still worried about high levels of government debt, despite the very low interest rates that we face right now. So let me stop there. Thank you very much, Alan, for having me.
All right, thank you, Greg. The interest rate rises that we are launching into will surely, on those projections that you gave us, give us rising debt service, and someday who knows how high that will be relative to the budget, depending on where those interest rates go. But we'll come back to that. Karen is also talking to us today about fiscal policy. It is interesting, Greg, you mentioned Doug Almendorf. I think Karen knows Doug very well. And the three of you, as I've learned, is Alan Greg is a student of Alan, and Karen is a student of Greg. I'm a student of all of you. So, Karen, it's all yours. Thanks.
Thanks, and thanks for inviting me. I think I'm sharing my slides. You can see them, right, Alan?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to start by defining what's new about the economy in the 21st century. And I'll start with a point that's already been made, but I'll make it just one more time, which is that interest rates are very low, as Greg said. It's something like a 4 or 5 percentage point decline since the early 1990s. And this, it's not just a crisis story, it's a downtrend. It's not just a US phenomenon. It appears, as Greg said, to reflect a broad reduction in desired investment relative to saving. Most of the forces thought to be driving the decline, things like demographics, technology, what Greg was talking about, are not expected to reverse. And interest rates may not stay this low, but most forecasts have them only reaching levels that would imply a very different environment for policymaking than anyone was projecting when the 21st century started. Also new, relative to where we thought we were entering the century, more economic volatility. To this point, I was one of the people who was writing about the sources of the Great Moderation 15 years ago. I've got it marked on this chart here. It was that quiet period where kind of high frequency volatility was low, but also we had these very mild recessions. Now, having lived through the financial crisis, the Great Recessions, and 2 years of pandemic economic weakness, I'm teaching a course on financial crises and recessions. So much for the Great Moderation. I will say, the other thing about economic volatility, and this was underscored by the Great Recession, was the potential for economic scarring, which at least when I was in grad school, wasn't something we worried about so much. We thought about kind of hysteresis as being something that happened in the old days or something that happened in Europe, but we just didn't put a lot of weight on it. But looking at the Great Recession, there's evidence of scarring in the aggregate. What you can see in the left panel is how GDP stepped down in the Great Recession and then started growing again, apace with the earlier trend, but it never got back to that earlier level. There's also scoring or evidence of scoring at the individual level. This is a graph I've gotten a presentation actually I'm doing later this afternoon, but in the right panel, you can see the black line is for people who didn't experience unemployment during the Great Recession. Their consumption has been about flattish over the past couple of decades. The red line shows people who experienced a year or more of unemployment during the Great Recession, and you can see their consumption has stepped down materially and stayed lower. So this heightened economic volatility, I think it's likely to continue. I don't think we're going to be doing more research about a Great Moderation anytime soon. I think one of the things that makes me think this is that the combination of the low interest rates and a more complex financial system make the economy more prone to bubbles and financial cycles. The Great Recession was, of course, a financial cycle, but there are arguments that the two preceding recessions in the United States, they were very mild, but they were arguably bubble-driven as well. And as much as I hate to say it, I think we need to be prepared for more cycles of COVID, maybe other diseases. We've also learned that monetary policy, because of low interest rates, is going to struggle more to fight recessions. Finally, what else is new? I would say more worries about economic inclusion. And I'm not going to wade into the debate about exactly what economic inequality has done over the last 20 years, because measuring economic inequality is not straightforward, and there are disagreements about exactly how much inequality has evolved over the past decade or two. But I do think it's clear that the hope of the late 1990s, that a rising tide would lift all boats, which is something that looked like maybe it was occurring in the late 1990s, that's just not been borne out. So instead, we have stark income inequality as we did then, starker wealth inequality, and then we've got a variety of other measures showing lives are not improving or getting worse across much of the socioeconomic distribution. So we've got limited economic mobility, unequal increases in lifespans. Relatedly, these deaths of despair. We've got communities decimated by the China trade shock. And of course, this leads to concerns at the individual level, but these trends are also hurting everyone via damage to the social fabric, more polarization, less trust in institutions, more support for populist policies, and so on. So with this setup, let me now go to the policy implications. Let me talk about what's new about the appropriate role for government in the 21st century. So First, let me talk about the need for good counter-cyclical fiscal policy. It's always been important, of course, but even more need. The obvious point here is that the issue is pressing because, as we've already discussed, we have even more need for good counter-cyclical fiscal policy because of more economic volatility and the limitations of monetary policy. Also, the last 2 recessions have underscored the point that we shouldn't be focused just on stimulus as an objective with counter-cyclical policy, I think, in this period right now, particularly if supply is constrained. And this idea that the sole focus shouldn't be stimulus, this is something about that I've been kind of become passionate about in my teaching of macro. I won't give people full credit for saying the only reason, they're the only metric for appraising fiscal policy is looking at the multiplier. I think the scarring issue is really important. And I think we need more study of it and the role of policy in limiting it. To underscore this point a little more, the vast majority of academic literature on the COVID checks, and we've had a wealth of terrific papers, but they've been focused really on MPCs, which is implicitly about multipliers, implicitly about stimulus. There have been far fewer papers speaking to the impact on scarring. Anyway, getting back to what we need to do, we need to enhance automatic stabilizers. That was a big conversation pre-COVID. I hope we'll come back to that. I think even people who think that fiscal policy was a big success during the pandemic think we could have done better if policy hadn't been so go, stop, go. And we hadn't used up so much political energy on that. So I think we need to aim for fewer gaps in safety net coverage. We know there are big differences in take-up of safety net programs. And I think we need to make more use of automatic triggers linked to economic data that will turn on enhanced benefits or expand benefits or just turn on benefits altogether. When the economy gets in trouble, then kind of reduce the benefits as the economy gets better and eventually turns them off. At the same time, we need to recognize there are limits to automatic stabilizers. So we still do need discretionary fiscal policy. Just a couple points related to what we've just been through. Database triggers wouldn't have been fast enough in the spring of 2020. Remember, we saw the economy just plunging in April 2020, and we wouldn't have gotten those data for a month. More than that, I think the optimal design of countercyclical policy is going to differ by episode, depending on the cause of the shock. But another example, which applies to the most recent episode, is that moral hazard considerations differ by episode. There's less worry about taking advantage of the system in a massive, unexpected pandemic, for example. So I think we still need to be ready to use discretionary countercyclical policy. Relatedly, given this need, I think we'd be well served by more granular data, high quality, granular, timely data on what's going on in the economy. One thing I have kind of noticed, as I'm sure many people have over the past 22 months, is that there's been this explosion in big data speaking to distributional issues over the last 2 years. But the thing that strikes me is that it hasn't helped policymaking as much as one might expect. And part of what we've seen is that different sources on supposedly the same thing, they point in different directions, which is allowing people to kind of use the data source they like to make their argument. There are concerns about representativeness. There's a lack of transparency in some of these sources on the underlying methodology. So I think these are good efforts, but I think the end game is going to involve a partnership of these sorts of sources and trained and accountable federal statistical efforts. Second new role for government in the new economy is to implement fiscal policies that invest in kids and in education and training. Investment in kids is important because of the heightened worries about economic inclusion, and because we have seen research in the 21st century showing that a number of interventions are win-win-win. They win because they reduce immediate hardship. They win because they pay off over the longer run for the economy by raising adult skill levels and adult labor force participation, adult health, and so on. I've cited some of the important sources, but there are many excellent papers that are in this area. And they also win because they pay off over the longer run for individuals by enhancing economic mobility. Investing in education and training. That means programs for the very young, programs for school age children, and programs for adults. The literature on education, generally, my reading of it is that generally shows that more money can help, and also that there are better and worse ways to use the money. I have some citations here, but in particular, there's a nice Aspen Economic Strategy Group proposal that says we should push more money to community colleges, but we need to couple it with reforms to make sure the money is used well. Knowing how to effectively train people later in life, that's been a long-standing challenge, but there's an emerging view that there are some things that do seem to work. My colleague Larry Katz has some research in this regard. I don't want to leave this area without offering just a couple of cautions. One is that the literature on successful specific interventions, it's very important, but it's still developing. It doesn't imply that everything along these lines will be worth it. And we don't know how scalable many of these interventions are. Moreover, there's a real opportunity cost because of fiscal constraints, which brings me to my third topic. And this is going to overlap a little bit with what Greg was saying. The good news here, so my third point is just that despite the new feature of low interest rates, the federal government still faces a real budget constraint. And I would say the good news here, and I have the same graphs as Greg, just in slightly different formatting, is that federal debt service today is about the same share of GDP as 20 years ago, even though debt has risen so sharply. And this is really just such a remarkable combination. But even with the low interest rates, debt is projected to soar relative to GDP over the longer run because of the disconnect between the growing older population and rising healthcare costs and what's a stable revenue base. So there's that problem that we need to be tackling. And I would also point out there's more risk. When you have a ton of debt, and you've got low interest rates, any given percentage point in rates has an outsized effect on government finances. So CBO, very appropriately, when they do their projections, they look at how their projections change with interest rates, and it's really quite striking. They have a projection that adds just 5 basis points a year, and then another 5 the next year, and so on and so on. That raises debt by 60% of GDP over the next 35 years. So bottom line here, increases in spending, apart from true emergencies, my view is they should generally be accompanied by cuts in other spendings or increases in taxes. But given the huge cost from a lack of inclusive economic growth that I was talking about earlier, spending to facilitate inclusion is worth the costs. It's worth these costs in terms of cuts or increases in taxes. This is my last slide. I think I'm out of time, but just a couple of final points. One particular fiscal program that will need to get more attention in coming years is Social Security. If you're interested in this topic, there's a panel later this afternoon at 3:45 on this topic that I'm participating in. So come see what we have to say. We'll be talking about things including the point about lower interest rates that Greg brought up. And then I can't really close without saying there's just a couple of crucial issues related to the new role of government that I didn't get to. Alan already talked about monetary policy, but the need to address climate change. There are important. There's an important role for government there. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Karen. You have touched in the role of the government in the 21st century on New Deal-like kinds of things, having to do with some innovative things to do for the government, including a very big one, not mentioned so far, we'll talk about it later, climate change, very much and prominent in terms of the number of dollars in the Build Back Better proposals of the Biden administration that are now sitting quietly, not so quietly in Congress, But adding up the numbers for Build Back America, that's a transformational change if our society does it. As a forecast matter, we're assuming it doesn't get done until next year if it gets done. And I'll want to come to you with that. The remaining dimension here of what the title described as the changing global economy, the two dimensions of that, that's technology, which the wave of technology, new technology innovations, I think is the biggest one in history, and that's going to be very debatable. I saw Eric on the participant list, and he may want to make a comment on that issue. I see it in zillions of ways. I'll say something about it, but it's part of the global economy, and the sweeping change in the structure of the global economy, along with the geopolitical lineup in the global economy, paid attention to, interestingly, by Biden in his long-run views of China versus the US and the competition between China and the US. It's a longer-run issue, but it is part of, if you go back to the 30s, part of the global world at that time and the geopolitical aspects of what went on. And Branko Milanovic is tremendously expert on this issue, as well as on something else touched so far by you, inequality, a huge societal issue and economic issue for the United States. So Branko, thank you for joining us. I see your title on the screen. It's the floor is yours. Can you hear us? Branko? Hello? Are you unmuted, Branko?
Yes, I think can you hear me?
Now I can, yes.
Okay, sorry for that. So
Yeah.
once again, actually the third time, so thank you very much for the invitation. Of course, it's a pleasure to be here. The topic I am going to speak is a little bit different from the topics that you have covered so far. I'm actually glad that Karen did mention the word inequality, so I would be actually speaking mostly about that in US and China. My argument basically here is the following. I will show you some numbers about inequality in the US and China. My argument is that there were significant similarities in the movement of inequality in both countries since the 1980s. Then there are similarities in the turning point or the more fitful increase in income inequality since about 2010, 2012. And then there are similarities in the forthcoming policy changes. I want to emphasize this last point, and I would actually say something, of course, towards the end, because I think this is the way that we should look at the policy changes which have happened over last summer in China, seeing them not really as fundamentally different from what may be the desired policy changes in the US. So I think there is much more similarity there than strikes the eye, at least when you read the media or the newspapers. So here is the most general graph about US and China inequality since the since 1975 in this particular case, or actually 78 in the case of China. China graph, these are Gini coefficients for the disposable per capita income. The China numbers are in blue, the American numbers are in red. As you notice, of course, the American increase in inequality is much less steep than Chinese. China starts with the Gini, which is under 30 Gini points and almost reaches 50. And currently, as you can see, it's basically at the level of 47. That level has not changed. I have to mention, however, that when it comes to microdata from China, we have many fewer of the microdata than we used to have. So basically, we have to rely on what the government tells us is the Gini number. But there is more to that than only that, because we do notice, of course, that inequality between provinces in China has declined. the inequality between rural and urban areas has declined, and also the wage differential between skilled and unskilled labor has gone down. So essentially from the 2010 approximately, there was a sort of a decline, moderate decline of inequality in China. In the US, as you can see, basically after a steady increase in the 1980s and the 1990s, we really basically have sort of a small increase or changes, but changes in two directions. So let me then go for the one striking graph, which you might have seen, and this is from 1986 to 2007. This is the increase in real income on per capita basis across US income percentiles. So this is the graph that I think many people have seen. It's up to 90th percentile. The increase is about 20% cumulative increase in 20 years, which means like less than 1% per year. And then, of course, after the 90 or 95th percentile, we have really an exponential increase and going up to almost doubling of real incomes. Now, I could have put any end year. I mean, the graph would look, it actually does look at more or less the same if I take it to 2019. However, I didn't do that because I wanted to show something which I think is not perhaps very well known, is how the effect of the global financial crisis were really played out on the US income distribution. Now, the blue line shows you, these are always the growth incidence curves. So on the horizontal axis, you have your percentiles of US income distribution from the poorest on the left to the richest on the right. Now, the red line shows you what happened between 2007 and 2010. Now, notice that everybody is in the negative range. So in other words, everybody's real income went down. But the real income decline was the most severe for the very top and actually pretty severe for the bottom. Now, look at the next 3 years. They're in the middle. So really, basically, the entire middle class, upper middle class, and everybody else was at around zero. But the top actually regained some of the losses they have made in the previous 3 years. And you also notice, which I think is mostly because of the extension of the unemployment benefits, you notice a relatively large increase in the bottom. So that was the story from 2006 to 2013. And finally, I want to show you something which, again, also I don't think has received attention, maybe because it is actually brand new, is what happened during the Trump era. And I stopped with 2019, actually I stopped before COVID. So there, what we find very interesting is large increases at the top and the bottom. So the increase at the top was not surprising because everybody was expecting that, and there was a cut in taxes for the rich people and so forth. But there was a very significant increase on the bottom, which I think I actually have not looked at that, but I think it's probably because of lower unemployment. So this is the more recent story in the US. Now, the more recent story in China, as I mentioned before, was a slowdown in the increase of inequality. Here, I'm looking at actually it was from somebody else's paper from Ding, Fu, and He. They are looking at inequality of gross income in private and state-owned enterprises. As you would expect, inequality in SOEs is less than in the private sector, but you notice again in the 2000s, slowdown in the increase in inequality of wages in this particular case. So essentially in China, we have had, as I said, a slowdown in increase in inequality, or actually reversal with sort of a moderate declines. And then we have, I would call 4 structural similarities between US and China. First one is a rising share of income from capital and a very and extremely high concentration of capital incomes. China has had, of course, increase in the share of capital in net income, and so did the United States, and I'll show you a very high concentration, which again is not surprising. Then the rising power of monopolies, we already talked about that, so I will be very brief on this. Then the expensive education as a way to transfer privilege and limit social mobility, which I think is the case for both China and the US, and what I can call political corruption in both countries. So here is from Chinese microdata 2013. this is the amount of capital income by percentile of income distribution. As you notice here, basically, there is almost no capital income for the first half of the distribution. Then it increases somewhat, these are in absolute amounts. I could have drawn it as a share of income. It would look the same and or similar. And then, of course, really extremely high incomes at the top of the income distribution. Now, you will see now next the US slide. And you would not be remiss to believe that basically there is not very significant difference. The two graphs look very much alike. You see, of course, also in the US case, the increase is more gradual, but still, as you know from the wealth data, about 1/3 of the US population has either zero net assets or negative net assets. And then the return obviously from capital are very small or zero for quite a lot of people, and then they increase very substantially. Now, the Gini coefficient for capital income in the US has been forever like around 0.9, which essentially means an extremely high, almost incredibly high inequality. As you know, the Gini coefficient for wages has ranged about 0.4 up to in gross wages 0.5, and capital is, of course, much more unequally distributed in both countries. When you have an increase in the capital share, that obviously immediately sort of almost arithmetically leads to an increase in inequality, because the source, which is very unequally distributed, becomes more important. So the next point is the one that I mentioned about education. This has been studied so much in the US. I just took one slide here from Chetty, Friedman, Size, and the others. That's the slide about the college attendance by parental income level. This has been so well, I think, established now. There was, of course, that recent book that I like by Markowitz, which talks about the fact that total investments that parents have to make to get their kids throughout the whole educational system into the top schools, which includes then investment when the kids are starting at 4 years of age, is between $5 and $10 million. So that really, the educational attainments have really, top educational attainments have become, of course, inaccessible for the middle class, and they have been used, I think, as a sort of a monopoly of the rich to transfer the advantages to their offspring. And I think this is both true in China and the US, and I would come to Chinese topic just one more time at the end. Now, the next point is about corruption. Now, this is from my book, Capitalism Alone, and this is a topic I'm working more now with two Chinese authors. Now, what here this graph shows you is the official amount of embezzlement of people who have been found guilty. Now, they're really in both cases, there are 3 levels of administrative units. You have county, prefecture, and provincial level. Now, what you notice that basically the graph slides upward, meaning that with a higher level of administrative unit, the embezzlement is larger. In other words, it is actually more valuable to be at the higher unit, like the provincial unit versus, for example, county, because you have the access to more money and people would pay you more in terms of bribes to get something from you. But what is also interesting, if you compare the red bar, which is the embezzlement of people who are in the Communist Party apparatus, versus the embezzlement of people who are in non-Communist Party apparatus, which are government level or private companies, you notice that actually in 2 out of 3 cases, you have the red bar exceeding the blue bar, meaning that, again, the political power is obviously at the party level, and it's more valuable. Actually, you can extract greater bribes if you're more valuable, and obviously you're more valuable if you're in the party apparatus than if you're in the government apparatus. Now, in the case of the United States, I have used, that was also a quote, actually, this is something that I used in my book, in Capitalism Alone, that the political contributions in the US, as you know, are extremely highly concentrated. I actually don't think that there is any expenditure that really matches the concentration of political contributions. You can read here that 1% of the top 1% contributed 40% to the of the overall contributions during the 2016 elections. And then the wealthiest 400 Americans contributed always more than 70% of all contributions, and in the elections to 2012, up to 81% of all contributions. So basically, this is the rule, what I call of the 400, like the Council of the 400 in Athens during the Peloponnesian Wars. So this kind of a political concentrated power, which is linked with money, I think is something which is very similar to China and the US. So now I would, finish the presentation by sort of looking at what are the similarities in policies. Now, the first, desirable policies will be reducing economic and political power of monopolies and the extraordinarily wealthy. Make education more affordable to the middle class, which I think holds also for both countries. Reduce political corruption, and broaden the ownership of assets. So what has been done, my last slide, if you look at the situation in China, I think the most recent moves against Ant, Tencent, the large monopolies, which might have been forced, because I don't think that, that the government or the president exactly forecasted that, this IPO would take place at a given time, and the outcome would be the way that it happened, but it might have been forced, but it nevertheless happened. So basically, we do have an anti-monopoly trend in China. We do have it in the US with the Department of Justice, as you know, starting sort of actions against Google and Facebook. When it comes to education, we have the end of the tutoring schools for profit in China. I'm not totally convinced that it would actually solve the problem. The problem was essentially that a so-called public system really didn't make any sense, because in order to get to the top schools, you had to have private tutoring, which was extremely expensive. Now, the objective was to get rid of this private tutoring, but I think essentially the rich people will be still able to hire tutors, even if they're not part of a school. So I'm not sure that actually that solves the problem as such. In the US, I don't think we have seen anything when it comes to the issue of education and the cost of education. Political corruption in China, the anti-corruption policy, which actually started with Xi, now what is that, 8 years ago. And in the US, I would see it as anti-discrimination policies, race and gender and so forth, but really nothing in terms of limiting the power of the very rich in influencing political decision-making and lobbying. Finally, the capital concentration, I don't think we see anything of that in China. I don't see anything about the taxation of the rich nor of capital incomes in China changing, or at least has not changed. And in the US, I see some moves of possible tax increase on capital gains, greater limits on trusts, and as a way to convey wealth across generations. So this would be, I would end here. My major sort of point was that the US and China have had an experience which is very similar in terms of both underlying factors of inequality and sort of empirical change in inequality. And I think that there is groundswell of some political support now in both countries to curb further increase of inequality and to sort of put in check some of the factors that have been behind it. So that will be all. Thank you very much.
Oh, thanks very much, very, very much for those comments. A little bit tongue-in-cheek, but not tongue-in-cheek. I smile when I hear about corruption in China and look back at the history of the United States and capitalism in the United States. So I have this view that it's part of capitalism. And it has been, along with how the system is used by the very rich in the United States to perpetuate their power and to increase wealth, and in a way that makes me pessimistic on the long run competition between the US and China, because it is, I believe, embedded systemically in the system. And I don't see anything happening in the United States to reverse that. That's a very gloomy long run prognostication on the US. And when I see Z, I use a phrase bluntly because I'm in the markets with people who want to hear things in 3 or 4 words. Kills capitalists and capitalism. That's what Z is doing, and makes a lot of noise about helping the poor people. You know, that's a good thing to do for those people. And it would be good if we were doing, I don't want to kill the capitalists in the United States, but we need to do more for the poor people of the United States. And that will get us back to what you all think about the Build Back Better program. What I want to do in some very brief comments and then open it all up is to just take a look at the future, understanding that forecasts, kind I do, are the center of a probability distribution of outcomes, so that I'm going to talk about a basic base case, highest probability as we see it now, including the data on Friday. A lot of forward-looking, a lot of scientific work, models, and the experience of 5 years of analyzing business cycles and how they work, and financial cycles. And Karen, for you, financial crises, and the financial factor in the business cycle, which is very big in the history of the United States. And let me just tell you what the forecast is right now. It's for an economy that over the next several years, including 2021, which was a strong year of growth, grows faster and stronger than any time since the 1980s, the years of Reaganomics and all that stimulus, and the 1960s, the years of the Great Society decade. Now, I'm only talking about 3-4 years because business expansions, and this one looks kind of compressed in time. So much is happening so fast for a lot of reasons. That very strong growth is very much demand driven and supported by what has been an extremely easy monetary policy, a lot of it put into place to save us from the collapse of the pandemic. The intentions were good, maybe overdone for too long, as Alan has mentioned, and perhaps to be unwound, and that's going to hurt in various ways as that happens, but not the growth of the economy, because back of what I've just said is an incredible amount of, let's call it fiscal stimulus, fiscal support and stimulus. To date, $7 trillion in 5 programs. That's $7 trillion nominal in a $24 trillion GDP nominal economy. 24 divided by 7 is over 30%, or less than 30%, 25 to 30% of GDP. And you can't find that kind of shift in fiscal policy initially supported by fully accommodative, really easy monetary policy anytime in history, including the 80s, including the 60s, and including the 1930s and World War II. It's just awesomely huge. Now, I know it's fading. A lot of its transfers meant to be supportive. It was well meant. If you add back the various costs of Build Back Better, which we're assuming won't happen until after, if it does, after the midterms, you're talking about even bigger numbers. This $7 trillion includes the $1.2 trillion infrastructure program just passed, $550 billion of which are about hard infrastructure spending, over which history tells us we should be skeptical in terms of, does it really get out there and do that? But that's a lot of stimulus. I have to call it unprecedented. I can't forecast the consequences of it except by analysis, but it can't hurt the economy. So between that and monetary policy, even as it gets less accommodative, and the pent-up demands of consumers and the saving that they accumulated in the economy that was shut down by a natural disaster, an external shock that it's like hit this planet. I don't know if you saw it, Don't Look Up, but that's the meteor hitting the planet. And the reverberations of that and the reactions to that in the system, which now change the system for the future in ways that lead to this strong growth forecast. What are the numbers? 5.8% Q4 over Q4 last year, 4.5% this year, 3.25%, 3.5% the year after, and beyond the next presidential election. Slower growth, but still probably growth. Business expansions without inventory cycles easily go 5 to 7 years now, and that's the history of the business cycle. Is what it teaches us. Along with that, since so much of it is demand side, demand pull, has to be a view and has been a view of higher inflation. And with that, because of the COVID shock, supply side restraints, so tremendous burst up after the pandemic of demand pull on the economy, pent up demands, all that stimulus. Tremendously liquid position for household sector in the aggregate. $17 trillion thanks to the better stock market of household financial assets, household net worth growth, which on our numbers is $600 billion of consumption spending in 2022. And the dynamics of the innards of the initial conditions of a healthy business cycle when all is hit gives us that growth path, gives us demand pull on inflation and a pattern starting with commodity prices, oil prices, now spilling into wage inflation with lags on the tightening labor market. That just looks classic. Demand pull with a supply side squeeze, giving us much higher than expected inflation, confronting the Federal Reserve, now telling us quite clearly in what I call the Powell bombshell, but Powell follows the data. I believe he will follow the data, and the data say inflation is more than ample for achieving price stability. And the data on Friday, which took the unemployment rate to 3.9%, 2 percentage points down in 6 months, and wage inflation only 4.7% year over year, but 6 months ago was almost nothing year over year. On the next 2 or 3 months, 6% and more. The Fed is behind the curve. So they probably will change the latest plan that they revised, and that's what the markets reacted to in raising interest rates and scaring the stock market, because the big risk to what I'm talking about here is too much inflation, the Fed behind the curve, raising interest rates, funds flows getting shut off, with all that fiscal stimulus, a boom bust. So it's an expansionary boom. The inflation numbers that go with the growth numbers I gave you are 6% year over year this past year, 3.5% this coming year. That's a deceleration, but still rising prices. A deceleration. I'm worried about that. And the 4% in 2024. That's higher than the Fed would allow. And it's higher than their forecast. It requires a deceleration with rising wage costs, compensation costs, that requires companies to find ways to keep costs down, like using more and more technology, substituting against labor for capital, magic of keeping those profit margins up to prevent them from raising prices more. So I think it's just baked in the cake, and the unemployment rate that goes with it for us after Friday was 3.4 at the end of next year, this year. Now it's 3.1. 3.1. That's lower than the pandemic 3.5%, lowest in 50 years unemployment rate. And the earnings with that are very strong, very, very strong. Strong earnings and a lot of policy stimulus. That's a very optimistic picture, most people say. It's something we haven't seen in decades. I think, Greg, during the Bush-Cheney administration and when you were there for several years, we did see growth rates that were very high, but the economy's excesses were so huge that when we got to 2006, the seeds of the next recession were built in because of the disequilibria inside the economy and financial system. That does not exist at this point. So that's the forecast, and it leads to the questions about policy and issues on whether we overdid it on monetary fiscal policy and what will happen as a consequence if these numbers turn out to be anything like roughly right. But that is really the remarks I have. I'm going to open this up. I just want to mention the technology effect in terms of those high profits in this world, despite rising interest rates. The interest rates that go with this forecast, the Fed forecast I would make, which is not their plan. Policy errors are rampant in Washington. You bet on policy errors and make more money than betting on policy successes over history. Traders know that. So they want to know what the Fed's going to do because they figure that most of the time the Fed will do it late or wrong and they make money on that. That's unfortunate, I think, but that's the way it is. And policy errors in the business cycle are a very big deal for booms and busts and volatility that gets to us all. The Federal Reserve forecast that goes with it for us has been 4 hikes next year. The tapering ends in March. First hike, 1/4 point each, 4 hikes in 2023, 2 hikes in 2024. I think we're so close to full employment, even widely defined by the Federal Reserve now, with demographic reaching down to the disadvantaged parts of our economy. That's laudatory. 3.9% is not far from 3.5, not that far from 3.1 on the kind of growth we have on an Oken's Law rough calculation updated. They're going to raise rates more, and rates will go up more than most people expect. What we expect is maybe 5 hikes. That would take the funds rate to 1.25 end of next year. 4 hikes the next year would take the funds rate to 2.25. Cash and equivalent rates would be a little lower than that. So us oldsters will earn some money on cash and equivalent. The 10-year yield that goes with that, because of demand side strength, because of the deficit debt financing, because of rising expected inflation, would be 2.5 to 3 at the end of this year, and 3.5 to 4. 4%, 3.5%, 3% scares everybody I talk to, but in real terms on our inflation forecasts, are those rates really high? It's still quite easy and quite supportive. Real interest rates would still be awfully low by historical standards, and not until funds flows are shut down and credit shut down does really the economy get into big trouble, where the innards of the system get so excessive that households and business have to make adjustments. The liquidity position of households and businesses, as I look at it and have for decades, financial condition is in aggregate for households in the non-financial business sector, super shape. Corporations are spending less than the cash flow. The earnings are so good. And households, household measure of financial conditions, we look at deteriorating a little bit lately, but the best it's been in years. That's an aggregate, and we think it's skewed by the wealthy, so we don't give as much of an impact on consumption as we used to. That, and with technology, I know Eric is out there, and technology is a very big deal for all of us and what we think. And I might ask Eric if he might give us a few minutes of what's going on in the technology revolution so everyone can hear that.
Sure. Well, I'm certainly one of those people who believes that we're having some really interesting times with new technologies, especially artificial intelligence. I mean, if we can solve some of the questions of intelligence, that's arguably the biggest thing that's ever happened to us, and we're on the verge of doing that in some areas and have made some progress. So it's kind of the ultimate general purpose technology. That has some very big effects on inequality that I've written about, many of you have written about, and I continue to work on. But I think I'll focus on another aspect of it, which is the effects on future productivity and interest rates. Some which are, by the way, are negative out as far as 30 years right now, according to the real yield curve. So, and I want to maybe build on or extend some of Greg's comments. I'm particularly sympathetic to his fourth explanation, if you remember those 6 explanations, the one that the idea that we're having some new kinds of technical change right now, and that's leading to different kinds of capital needs. I was recently talking to a tech founder who kind of sheepishly confessed that he couldn't think of what to do with the money that VCs and others were throwing at him, that, PCs were kind of piling up on the side and there's not much more he could do. What really was a scarce resource was some talent that he was looking for, and that wasn't something you could just throw money at. And obviously on the other side, the biggest company in the world, Apple is buying back hundreds of billions of dollars of stock and dividends, has I think about 60 or 70 billion dollars in the balance sheet. It seems that they don't have a lot of things to use it for. So there's an observation there that the kinds of capital investments for a lot of these, well, the biggest tech firms, as well as some of the most rapidly growing ones, aren't constrained by capital so much. I would make an observation, though, or maybe it's a hypothesis, that on the government side, it's a little different. I mean, when I look around at our roads and our bridges, our airports, the lead that's still in the water, as Karen noted, the teacher salaries and what could be done to improve our education, the return on investment on vaccines or pandemic preparation, the ROI on those seem to be quite high. And so maybe it's worth making a distinction between the ROI on the kinds of investments that private sector needs to make or wants to make versus what the government makes, and that at least you guys are the macroeconomic economists, but does that mean that we should be directing more investment into those kinds of areas? And when people talk about the deficits, it's disappointing that most of the discussion doesn't really make much of a distinction between investment versus consumption uses of those for those deficits. And that seems like so fundamental. Our future, our grandchildren and children will be richer if we make investments, and they'll be poorer if we do consumption. So that seems the fundamental thing. So this question of the ROI, I guess maybe I'll aim this one at Greg, is could there be different ROIs for different kinds of capital investment? And would that say something about what kinds of places we should be directing capital?
Oh, for sure. And I think we have actually made a distinction. I think you saw that in the first, the physical infrastructure bill, the bipartisan one. And I think there was a bipartisan consensus. There were a lot of high return investments there, and they did. I think there's a tendency in Washington to call everything an investment. And when you start hearing people saying, "Oh, we're going to devote more resources to caring for the elderly," and that's an investment. Well, though it's not, maybe a good thing or bad thing, but certainly not an investment. So I think you got to be careful. But I think you're right. There are high infrastructure things, and I think there is a big consensus that bipartisan infrastructure bill probably was a big step in the right direction. As long as I have the floor, can I ask Alan a question on monetary policy? I agree with everything Alan said. The thing that intrigues me the most is this idea of whether bygones are bygones. And when you're undershooting, the Fed basically decided that bygones are no longer bygones when they were undershooting, in order to give themselves more room to be dovish, right, and expand a little more and let catch up on the previous undershooting. But now we're in the opposite situation where we're overshooting inflation. And I'm wondering whether the Fed's going to regret their change in policy, and whether they're going to say, well, now bygones are bygones again, and now we don't have to worry about that, or whether they're going to say, oh, well, we're price level targeters, and therefore we want to get back to the path and have to undo all the inflation we're seeing over the past year.
Yeah, I think it's a fair question, and my guess, it's only a guess because among other things, we don't know how long the high inflation episode's going to last. I'm still on team transitory, as you know, but there is an overshoot. And if I bring you back to the academic debate, it was only academic then, of about 20-ish years ago, between price level targeting and inflation targeting. The reason that opinion went to inflation targeting was exactly that in a period, following a period of high inflation, you'd have to really crunch down on the economy more than you'd like to. And so opinion went away from price level targeting towards inflation targeting. So it's exactly the reason that you said, Greg. And I just finish off with, I think my last slide said something like it's a more dovish Fed, and I had the word permanently in quotation marks. So nothing's permanent, but I think for a good long time, we're going to be looking at a dovish Fed that won't like the idea of crunching the economy enough to get back to 2% inflation. Sorry, to get below 2% inflation anytime soon.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. But I do think they've unfortunately made another mistake. It wasn't a mistake to immediately cut rates to zero with the pandemic shutting us down. It wasn't a mistake to go to quantitative easing, and it wasn't a mistake to open up the lending spigots directly from the Fed to the private sector, because you can't trust the system to get those flows into the private sector that needed it at that time. It's the nature of the shock. But the response to it and the time lag, and unfortunately, from the point of view of now, the post-emptive strategy replacing preemptive strategy looks like a mistake, because the inflation process, in my view, is embedded in the system now in a classic business cycle upturn that is being promoted in size and scope by the policies that were designed to help us out. Suppose there had been no pandemic. Well, we never would have had a shutdown. We would not have had the pent-up demands that are unleashed on the economy now, and all that saving in the household sector because you couldn't spend, save, or work. But we would not have had that easy monetary policy perfectly timed to support the economy in its collapse. We would not have had all of that fiscal stimulus, which is unprecedented in terms of its implications with regard to debt. As inevitably interest rates have to rise, debt service goes up to bring us back into another big problem, maybe 2-3 years down the road. And it may muck up the need for societal change that was in Karen's comments and many of us, I think, here. So I think the Federal Reserve has doubled down on the first mistake by now being post-emptive. I don't think it's in the bowels of the institution to go back to the Phillips curve approach, but look at the unemployment rate in the last 6 months, 5.9 to 3.9, and look at inflation rates, both price inflation and wage inflation. Doesn't that look like classic Phillips curve? It's only 6 months. But
Can I ask one more question on the monetary policy front? Another one for
absolutely.
Alan.
Yes, go ahead.
So my sense, and I think this came through in your remarks, is that the change was motivated by, at least in part, by distributional concerns and what's happened to the distribution over the decades. What do we know about the distributional consequences of inflation? I hear people starting to talk about that now.
I think what we used to know, this is not very recent work. What we used to know was this old saw that inflation is the cruelest tax because it screws poor people was just wrong. Wrong in 2 dimensions. The obvious one is that everything hurts the poor more than it hurts the rich. Everything from mosquitoes to inflation and everything in between. So that part of it was true. They're always hurting more. But if you actually looked at the distributional impact of inflation, what you saw years ago, and I think it's still true, is that it's very bad for the stock market. And we know who holds stocks. And so if you look at wealth, I think it's not a full explanation by any means, but one of the reasons for the fabulous stock market in recent years has been the super low inflation rates that we've experienced. So the notion that you should fight inflation in order to help the poor, I think, especially when you remember how you fight it, which is to weaken the labor market, is a bogus notion.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I totally agree with that. It's the relatively poor. It increases relative inequality. The rich people are smart enough to find ways to stay rich. And a lot of absolute dollars, if you take 5 or 10% of a big number, the absolute dollars go up. If you take 5 or 10% of a lower number, absolute dollars go up, but not that much. Look at all the billionaires. Look at all the multimillionaires. Billionaire now is out there like millionaires used to be out there. You see it in prices of luxury items anywhere. What's $150 million for a penthouse apartment in New York when you are a multi-billionaire? It's raising inflation because it filters down for everybody, and the poor, relatively speaking, get poorer. And that aggravates inequality more, and that's a political issue. We should open this up to some comments and questions from out there on the chat, which I think everybody can see.
I think Jamie Galbraith had some comments. Maybe you should call on Jamie. I see his face there.
Yeah, Jamie is there, and then there's a question about inflation. Jamie, please interact with all of us here.
Thanks very much. And it's been a great discussion. I appreciate it greatly. My questions were obviously rhetorical. They were of two types. One, what are the implications for all of these forecasting failures for the way we think about macroeconomics and the way we teach it, or the way some people do? It doesn't suggest that we've been barking up the wrong tree for at least half a century, that we really need some fundamental reconstruction of this field. That was number one. And number two was simply in response to the several people, but especially Karen Dynan's comment about the real budget constraint facing the federal government. Real resources are being absorbed to an extraordinary extent in the rather functionless expenditures on the military. And those are the kinds of expenditures which could be redeployed for the purposes of meeting the physical challenges, infrastructure, climate change, and other things that we face. And I would just like to put that on the table, especially since this is a session of economists for peace and security, and it's been the historic concern of this particular association. Thank you.
Go ahead, everybody. Go ahead.
I would just take slight issue if I understood Jamie's comment with using 50 years. I don't think it's failed for 50 years, but it's failed for 20 years, which is long enough. So this is a rhetorical point. The truth is, I think it still needs to be said because a lot of people don't realize it. The US Phillips curve fit data pretty darn well, not perfectly, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and well into the 90s. And then it went kaplooey. But as I said a moment ago, 20 years of failure is more than enough reason to look for something else.
I'll weigh in and say, I think, so one of the implications there is that we should not be fixated on baseline forecasts so much. And I'm not sure policymakers are. I mean, I think a lot of the criticism we saw of the Fed over the past year just assumed they thought the only outcome was what they were saying was the baseline forecast. Now, I think, so I think policymakers need to be thinking about, ranges of outcomes and need to be identifying key policy decisions, at least somewhat off of kind of what's going to be robust to those different outcomes. And so I think in some ways, you could say, for example, a wait and see strategy with monetary policy is I think maybe following that strategy, but I don't know. I mean, when it comes to the past year in monetary policy, I think it's clear that inflation has come in kind of outside even the kind of range that people were talking about.
And part of the Phillips curve discussion is it's a reduced form equation, if that, of the structure that's behind it. So the question is the structure behind it and the correlation that we have seen over decades between the unemployment rate and inflation, and the use of that relationship by policymakers for many years as a paradigm or guidance in monetary policy making. So if I diagnose what's going on in the economy, on inflation, and in the labor market as demand pull, classic strong demand fed by very stimulative monetary and fiscal policies, then shouldn't I expect inflation to go up and the unemployment rate to go down, because demand is going to go into the labor market directly and derive, tighten the labor market, along with generating product side demand. We have two shocks. We have demand shock and we have a supply shock, which I think is smaller than I ought to expect to see in the next 6 or 8 months, or the past 6 months, a declining unemployment rate and a rising inflation rate. And then if I do a reduced form correlation, it's a very short period, Alan's right, 20 years is long enough. So he's now going to reject the reemergence of the Phillips curve, when I think, Alan, it used to be a guiding light in the 1990s in preemptive policy. And what I'm doing is saying that could be a mistake. It could be the wrong thing to do. And I have to laugh, because it wouldn't surprise me as an economist and as a forecaster, because there are plenty of scars in forecasting, to have learned that the stuff we see in the correlations, first of all, unless we understand the causes and the structure behind it, I think we're fooling ourselves just to go by correlations. And second, they change because the underlying conditions change. And the underlying conditions now, as I described in the forecast, may be wrong. Jamie, I take your point, perfectly fine, may be wrong, but it is a massive amount of stimulus. And even just think about real interest rates. If the funds rate does go up the way I said, and the long bond yield does go to 3.5 or 4, right now it scares everybody and you sell stocks on that thought. But you know what? If the earnings drive high, the stock market will still be going up on average. It just won't be going up as much. So what I'm saying is a methodological point. We have to look under the correlations. And we're all on this panel going to buy that, because we rejected the correlations of Milton Friedman, pure money income correlations, which disappeared once the structure of the economy disappeared. And now the relationship between monetarism and the economy, it's very different from M's. It went away with changes in institutions. The mechanism is evolving, it's changing, and the conditions change. We wouldn't be having what I described, in my opinion, if we hadn't had the pandemic, the responses to it in the system, and then the responses of the system to what we did in responding to the pandemic. It's a very interesting episode in business cycle history. Tragic in one way. In another way, frankly, I think we still had Trump. We might have had Trump as president if not for the pandemic. So I'm delighted that that knocked him out, if it did. But I've talked too much. We had something from Ed Keene, a question. Ed, we'll make you a co-host. Just ask the question on inflation for the panel. Are you still there? Ed? I'll read the question then, just a second. Regarding the recent pickup in inflation in advanced economies, not just the US, some observers have likened the current situation to what happened in the immediate years after World War II, while others have compared the situation to that of the 70s. What are the thoughts of the panelists on these comparisons? Greg?
I think a lot of it, the question is whether it's to be transitory, as Alan has argued in his Wall Street Journal column, and what was true after World War II, or more permanent, is going to depend on what's going on in the labor market. Certainly a lot of what's going on here is temporary stuff involving supply chains, but I think we also have a very tight labor market, and you're starting to see it in wage growth. You're seeing very high quit rates. You're seeing it in starting to see in wage growth. I think yesterday's employment report had a very high reading on the average hourly earnings. So I think it'll be less transitory to the extent it gets built into wage expectations and wage norms. And I agree, it's part of it's going to be. It's not going to stay at 7, But I'd be surprised if it falls back down to 2 very quickly.
I agree with that. And Greg also agrees, he just left out. The other place it gets embedded is in expectations, which we've seen a little bit, but not very much yet. And you got to watch that.
The history of expected inflation is there's a change in actual inflation, which initially, this is the bond market version of expected inflation, but I don't think it's too far from the truth generally. And it's a more general notion of how expectations are formed. Greg, you've written a lot about that, and it's a fascinating topic. You and colleagues have written about this. The actual inflation changes, and nobody thinks it's for real, even without knowing the sources of it. You need to know that. It's sloughed off. Then it stays for a while. Then people begin to wonder why, and then they look and they find reasons, and it's kind of cooking in the system because it's a lag in the system, inflation historically, statistically. And then when they see it high long enough, they find reasons to explain it. I've explained it. And so I should expect expected inflation to rise. And we are seeing in a bunch of different measures of it, including our proprietary one, it's rising. Now the Fed watches that. And the bond market watches that. The 10-year bond yield in the models I have built responds very quickly when there's a change in expected inflation, but that change takes a long time. It's a Pascal lag distribution model of how that works. But then boom. So the Fed is next, not just going to see this really low unemployment rate, but they could already say, looking at the various measures they look at, what you said, Alan Blinder, that expected inflation is beginning to creep up. And it's going to keep on going up if actual inflation stays high. The biggest worry I have is accelerating inflation. The deceleration of the 3 to 4 range, to me, is a piece of cake. We'll get through that. I'm worried about the history of wage costs, other commodity costs, companies raising prices, and relying on technology and the disruptive technical change that Eric has written so much about to keep price inflation down enough so we don't get accelerating inflation. If we get that, then we're going to have a recession with lags because the Fed will have to totally change what they do. That's a risk.
In the chat, Eric Brynjolfsson raised the good question of whether we should be happy targeting inflation at 3 rather than 2, just to give us more room to cut interest rates in the next downturn. Yeah, the dirty little secret of monetary policy is that 2 is kind of an arbitrary number. They kind of picked it out of the air. I think New Zealand did it first, and everybody said, oh yeah, 2, that sounds good. But I don't think there's a lot of good economics behind 2 rather than 3. In fact, I once joked to Alan Greenspan that he should target 3.14, so that explains why we always call it pi in our models. But I think central bankers now are scared to say anything other than 2 because it looks kind of feckless. Like, yeah, we said 2, but 3's fine to go at 2. You know, we're good. We're good. So I think they've sort of boxed themselves in with this number 2 without a lot of the good science behind it.
Greg,
I agree with that.
Right. The New Zealand guy, they picked 2, and it worked. Because it worked, somebody else picked 2. It's called the herd instinct. The central bankers follow the other central bankers, and they don't really necessarily know why. I think there's been more research on it since then. Mary Daly of the San Francisco Fed got into a little bit more. But the question of why is 2 or an average 2 the right number is a really
an important part of that, quote, decision made back then was the belief that at 2, worries about the effect of lower bound were minimal. We would hardly ever encounter it. And that's what history has proven dead wrong.
Yes, so the great thing about history is it proves a lot of things. If you live long enough, I hope we all do, in a healthy way, you're going to make a lot of wrongs. And the thing to do is figure out the wrongs, not necessarily the rights in making our way. I think we've run out of time. We have 30 more minutes for discussion that we're allowed to have for anybody who wants to stay on. I do want to thank the panelists for participating. I'm so grateful to you. I think lots of provocative issues were raised. I am smiling. You know, if you don't have humor when you get to be my age, you might as well die. And so I'm hoping to live a long, long time, helped by a sense of humor, because everywhere you look, you can find humor, positives, brightness, and good things in all people, even the people who you have big disagreements with. So I've had the great pleasure of working with and for the Darth Vader of the liberal world, that's Vice President Cheney, and now admiring his daughter. She's one of my heroes, standing out against the crowd. And I've had the pleasure of working with a dedicated American who I'm sure when she says is a good Catholic, she does. It's Nancy Pelosi. She prays for, that she prayed even for Donald Trump. I believe her. She's a wonderful American. She has views at one end. I think Vice President Cheney, despite what most people think, cared about the economy and the country. People have good goals. They just have different tactics about how they go about it. And then the rest of us can write our papers and argue and move on. But life is good. Thanks for joining us. And for those of you who want to stay on, we'll kick these issues around for a little longer if you want. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Alan.
So Greg, I don't know whether it's on or not, or whether it's just us. It's amazing how much that number was. It's a joke, 2%.
Oh yeah, well, yeah, it wasn't unreasonable. It was, but it's kind of a guess.
It's a guess.
It's a guess. That seemed reasonable, and yeah, and it came from New Zealand, and then it kind of spread. I think the herd instinct is exactly right.
Yeah, that's right. Well, did you ever read Adam Smith's the Money Game or something like that? Adam Smith. That was a pseudonym.
Yeah, not the real Adam Smith. Yeah, no.
With all the
partly
on the table.
And
if something starts at one end, gets to the other end, is totally different. Or everybody hears a word from somebody they think is a guru at the time. They rush out the door to buy or sell, and that is that world. That's the way that world kind of works. And the central bankers. And I think central banking is an incredible institution. Without it, we'd have inflation, probably astronomical inflation all around the world. But there is a herd instinct among central bankers as well, and among all of us in our fields. Karen, I think, had to go. She has another session. I see you're still there. I don't know about Alan Blinder or anybody else who's stayed on. 54.
Well, I have a quick question. I mean, if 3 or 3.14, by the way, you should start the 3.14 club, Greg, like your Purdue club. But if that, maybe partly tongue in cheek, if that's the right number, does that mean that the break-even inflation that is 2.48% right now is too low, and that we need to do more to boost inflation?
I think it's going to be a very hard thing for the central bankers to transition after saying 2 for so many years, and then saying, "Oh well, we know we've come down from 7 down to 3 or 4, but we're perfectly happy in that range." I think that they have a serious public relations problem.
Yeah, that's an institution. Institutions don't change very quickly until it's way too late. Eric, can the technology wave currents, unlike with Bob Gordon and the debates you had, argued these other technological changes were such a big deal? I think this one is even bigger because I see it, the S&P 500, it's a lot of smart money valuing the tech sector at almost 30% of the cap weight. And I see the employment numbers telling me that there's a real movement to what I call a technocentric economy, a structure, a big structural shift. And a lot of that is what Christensen called disruptive technology, and that I know that you're very much into. Can it keep inflation low enough and productivity, which maybe is not measured properly, high enough so we get through a high inflation period and get through it?
I don't know for sure. I am a little optimistic. Bob Gordon and I have a little debate on this. We've had a number of debates over the years, but there's the latest one. There's this website called Paragraph that we're sort of halfway through a debate where we're each arguing each side of that. And I'm taking the the productivity optimistic stand, but he would have been right for most of the past 10 years. So I got to give him credit that it's taking longer. My hypothesis is that there's a bit of a productivity J curve, like we saw with electricity, that you can get some amazing tech breakthroughs, but it just takes much longer for companies to change and the economy to re-engineer, because there's a lot of complementary investments that need to be made. And I'm betting that we're in the middle of doing that, and we'll start seeing them come online in the 2020s. But I've been over-optimistic in the past, so it may take longer.
Eric, don't give up so easily, because how do you explain the ultra low inflation?
Yeah,
Not
no,
just
well,
lousy growth. It's because of technological change the last decade of the kind that you talk about.
I think that's definitely part of it. I absolutely think that that's part of it. And I think that, I mean, the more importantly, I think that there may be a lot more of it in the pipeline. I think we're only just seeing the early parts of it. Like what I see, I'm here at Stanford now, and the folks are doing some just eye-popping things with machine vision and language models and other things. And very little of that has made it out into companies and industry. But in each case, there's such fundamental things like being able to see, being able to understand language, being able to reason, that it'd be hard for me to imagine that they wouldn't have some very big effects on how the economy is run. I've kind of learned that it takes a lot longer to get from the laboratory into changing supply chains and value added.
It does. Don't get up so easily on that argument with Bob, because the other thing that goes on is, if you look at the composition of capital spending by companies in aggregate, and you look at the technology component of it, which we just put in the national income accounts not too long ago, it's growing like topsy as a percent of equipment, and equipment as a percent of total CapEx is well over 80%. And so it's a totally different structure of capital spending that goes on now that involves software, intellectual property, and the data people are always behind.
We aren't measuring intangibles very well at all either, and that's really arguably what most of it is.
MIT is doing a big push into fusion energy. And if they actually manage to figure out how to create electricity from fusion, that's going to basically be a game changer, because it's completely clean and it could make energy incredibly cheap.
That's a perfect example. I saw some of that stuff. It's eye-popping and it's like, wow. And my first instinct was, boy, electricity is going to come down. And then I talked to them some more. And if you look at the timelines, it's the 2030s or something by the time, even if they get the working generator later this year or early next year, it's remarkable how many things you need to change to really change the energy infrastructure. So it's
a long-term thing for sure. It's very long-term.
Yeah, exactly. But on the order of a decade or two. And I think that one by itself, would, and there are a lot of other ones like that too, in terms of, mRNA vaccines and just the whole broad field of AI. So I end up feeling pretty optimistic about the medium to long term.
I hear there've been some great developments in blood testing recently too, huh?
But none of the tech folks, that was Henry Kissinger and folks like that went for that. I put that, there's tulips and there's, and I think a lot of Bitcoin is in that category too. There's definitely scams, and I think probably low interest rates lead to more of that for some reason. But let's not tar the entire industry with that.
I'm glad to hear that no distinguished economist was involved in that one that we're aware of. Only foreign policy types.
Well, George Shultz, was an economist.
Yeah. Oh, that's true. He is indeed. I take it back.
So Jamie, on the blood testing, I know the thing about Theranos. However, there is a legitimate company that does pricks the finger, gets blood out of a pricked finger, and has a platform. This is quite legitimate, that gets the test result back very quickly. And someday all of the blood draws that go on and at Wang at MGH, and all the people who do it won't be there, because and this one is being used widely already in Europe. So there are incredible things going on in medicine that are cost saving and kill jobs. And that's what this technology does. So a smart company that wants to maximize shareholder value is smart to outsource to the cloud human resources and everything they can to save costs to maximize shareholder value, which is the mantra of American business. And
That was the death of
and
American
those cloud
business.
companies
Because it
compete, keep
It
prices
promotes a
down.
short-term view, which has been the destruction of American industry by greatly to the advantage of our competitors, particularly in China.
Well, can you find a way to change that short-run view? I wish you could. I
Well, that's
agree with you, but it's the way it is.
partly a question of changing ideas, but yeah, if you just see where we stand. And by the way, the question of nuclear fusion, though, just in the press the other day, the Chinese ran a reactor for 17 minutes at 5 times the temperature of the sun. So maybe by the time that technology matures, we'll be importing that one as well.
Yeah. I wish you could change maximize shareholder value as the mantra of American business. It is the look at the stock buybacks with all the money they have. That's just to raise the value of the company. It can get excessive and collapse, but maximize shareholder value is how they run. And if I run it to maximize shareholder value, what am I going to do? I'm gonna, if I've got cash, I'm going to hire the smartest lawyers I can find to beat the system and put my accounts into other countries and run money through that, so I don't have to pay taxes in America. That's just the way it is. That's the way it runs. If you can find a way.
It's what gave us Donald Trump, Alan.
That's exactly right.
That's
exactly right. Well, but he's
both
totally
as an
corrupt.
avatar of that practice, but also because he played on the resentments of the of the regions that were left in waste by the.
But unless that changes or is altered or managed or policy to offset it, the long run future of this country is against, say, China, is in question. So I wish you could find a way to deal with it. I'd jump in there with you. So
if I could just interject two quick things though on that short-termism thing. There is a country, I forget which it is kind of discouraged quarterly reporting in favor of annual, which is still going to get played in any event. I forget which country changed regulations in some manner to do that. But second thing quickly on the 2% inflation target, couple of things I put in the chat that a lot of companies, they like to give zero raises because it's easy all around. They certainly don't like to give 5% cuts because it's bad for everybody. It's bad discussion, all that. So 0 for your worst employee and 3 for your best, it just rides very nicely. And I think it's a nice soft spot to sort of sit. The other thing is that, Friedman would say 0 is the right number, which clearly we know now is not the right answer. So 2 sounds like a little higher than 0, not that much higher. The one thing, this one's up for grabs, whoever wants it. For a couple of years, I've thought about writing an article. If Homer Simpson chaired the Fed, and with 8 fingers, the target would be 1/64th, not 1/50th, which would be 1.56%. And nobody would be talking about the Fed failing for the last 10 years to generate 2%. They'd be thrilled that we were sitting around 1.56. So I think there'd be so much hate mail in my direction. I don't have a venue for it to write that article, but I think it's a great title, and please somebody do it and credit me. But I think 2 is it's close to 0, but it's not 0. 3 feels like a real number. 4 and 5 feel like real numbers. 2 is it rounds down to 0. So anyway, that's my thought on that.
Thanks. Thanks. What else? We still got they'll still give us a few minutes. There are 36 participants, so this is open conversation here. So break in as switch to gallery view. Go ahead.
I think anybody can unmute and join the conversation, I believe.
That's right. Just unmute and just say your name and jump in. I just chunked the gallery view. I can see more people, but a lot of people have their names there, but they're gone incognito. They're wearing dark sunglasses. They're not on the video. So
if everybody's being quiet here, then I'll steal the floor for one more minute.
Go ahead, Howard.
The other thing, again, there was that sidebar about what the right comparisons are, and everybody talks about the 70s. Obviously, anybody our age, they don't shout out about the 70s. But the one thing that I think, the couple things I think people forget is that the 70s, it was a confluence of 4 different things. Everybody talks about oil, which was clearly the case. Everybody talks about monetary policy, which is clearly the case. People, to some extent, talk about COLAs when you had labor unions. into Social Security, other places as well, which is clearly the case. But the one that's rarely mentioned is that mid 70s, late 70s, all of a sudden you had women in the workforce, you had baby boomer, 2-family incomes buying houses, pushing up houses, which were in the COLAs under the formula before it was adjusted in the mid 80s. And that just looped right back around. So you've got the second, baby boomer at age 25 buying a house, pushing prices up. They certainly weren't being built as fast as they were being bid up. It went into the COLAs, everybody then increased off the COLA, and it just looped back around. And that housing component, which was pulled out, I think in 84, 85, as you know, we went to, which is admittedly problematic, but the owner occupied price within that. But in the early 80s, in late 70s, it was literally price of houses went up. That was inflation, even though you owned the house, and you got a COLA increase, even though you already owned the house.
I think you're going to see the housing component of the CPI, which is bigger than CPI than the PCE deflator. You're going to see that coming up because the way they measure rents for the CPI tends to lag. In particular, the way they measure the rental component is they have certain units they look at, and they basically say, "Oh, how much are you getting for this unit?" They're not looking at like how much would you get for this unit if you put it on the market today. So some of these things are under contract, so it's going to be a delay between when the new rents come up and when it shows up in the CPI data. In addition, they only survey every unit, so like every 6 months, so which also creates a further delay. So I think if you look at some of the private surveys of rents, which is basically saying how much are you renting things for now new, they've come up a lot more than the CPI rental component. And so I'm guessing the rental CPI is going to catch up to those private surveys, and you're going to start seeing that in the next year.
So that
Now,
gets
how
to
the feedback of the owner's equivalent rent is different. I'm not sure how they go from the actual rents on rental units to the owner's equivalent rent. I'm not sure how that's calculated.
Yeah, so Greg, that gets to so a basic point about what's going on in the index is you have basically asset prices that are being translated through to the CPI and that are pressing this up. And this was true of the used car component.
Yeah.
Those are earlier this year, and that was because of the supply problems in the new car market. People that go to used cars.
I think stuff like that's gonna. I think like the used car market.
Why would you raise interest rates in order to deal with that issue?
I don't think you should. I think that will.
I'm not saying you're advocating that. I'm just saying when the Fed, when it comes down to it, is the Fed going to say, well, maybe not?
I think that will reverse. I think the question becomes when it starts betting into wages. Some through discretion, some through COLAs, which are coming back in some degree. But to the extent that it doesn't look like the past 6 months wages growth has been quite strong.
Well, there's no Treaty of Detroit. It's still there. There's no auto, steel, rubber sort of connection that existed in the 70s. All these.
No, that's true. Yes, that's right. That's right. Yeah. I mean, union contracts are not nearly as big a deal as they were then. Yeah. There's some little more evidence of union activity than there has been, I think, 2 to 3 years ago. But right, I think that is one thing.
It's a very small part of the workforce compared to what it was.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah.
On interest rates, Jamie, the Federal Reserve is it's technically the overall PC, which does not have the weight of housing that the CPI does. So the CPI will overweight inflation, and they discarded it, went to the PC. And it's also talked about the core, and the core is lower because we got an energy price increase. Core is running a percentage point lower than the overall PC, but it's that consumption deflator, which is, I think our last number was over 5%. So we came in the year thinking 3.5 to 4 on inflation because of the demand rebound in the economy and the strong growth and supply side stuff. So we had a higher, and that inflation forecast turns out to be, which was pretty good actually, 2 percentage points lower, at least 1 percentage point lower, maybe more. Maybe the overall PC is running 5.7 year over year now. And the next few months looks like it's going to stay on the high side. So the Fed's got a problem because they've missed it by 3 times.
I wonder how
And
successful.
the unemployment rate's about to get to full
I put in
employment.
the chat, if they hold on until April or May, when the last year's 50% increase in gas prices drops from the year average,
Yeah.
guess what? The number's going to go down.
Yeah, that's
I
part of a
predicted,
forecast.
I predicted,
Why?
scientists
Yeah.
tell me that there are only 12 months in the year.
No, you're right. That's why we have 3 to 4. But here's my problem with 3 to 4. There's stimulus out there I've never seen before. I have no idea of what's that going to do to the demand side of the economy. There's pent up demand, the likes of which have not existed since post-World War II because of how we got shut down. And we're still shutting down in certain ways, and it's global. And when that disease goes away and it all unleashes, how
It'll
long
cause
is that?
backlogs in Shanghai. Big deal.
So I
Not gonna shut down
am
if they don't.
nervous about the inflation forecast. And wage inflation is rising. And I'm relying on technology and productivity to bail it out. And just what you said, the mechanics of the year-over-year comparison, I don't feel very comfortable that way as a scientist. I just don't. So it's a risk, because I know that if the inflation turns out 3 to 4, what does the Fed do? They're thinking 2.6, and then it goes down to the picture perfect 2%, which is fiction, because that's the long run equilibrium. That's how they do the forecast 3 years out. It's total bullshit. How they do that.
I agree with you, Alan, by the way, that the PCE deflator will probably come in below the CPI in the coming months. But and I know the Fed only looks at the PCE deflator allegedly, but the CPI is going to give them some political headaches because the CPI gets a lot of headlines.
Yeah.
And it's not going to be easy to say, oh no, it's inflation, the CPI, but it's only the CPI. But that's not how the public's going to perceive it.
So
the
that means
misery, the misery index had the CPI in it for sure.
Yeah, it's the big risk, that and how the Fed revises its plan. But even after they raise rates the way I said, if that turned out to be roughly right, real rates and the flows of funds in the system still look pretty good. The economy will do very well. Nominal rates alone don't take the economy down, as you all know, as students of and part of business cycles. Just nominal prices don't do it.
Yeah, it's going to still look pretty accommodative, even if the rates increases you're predicting. Yeah.
Yep. We're still here for another several minutes, I think. Still 25 people out there. Just unmute and talk. We won't bite. You could show your. No, I'm going to shut my video. I'm going to shut my video off because I see a lot of people are not showing up. You can take the video open too as well. Please, you don't get. This is a great day for me to be talking to these people. So it's wonderful. So
I'll come back with another just toss out another thought here, which is that it seems to me that the long-term risk to stability is the state of the dollar, and it's a crapshoot. Every crisis, the dollar goes up because it's the safe haven for the world economy. On the other hand, the long-term position of the United States as the central piece of the world system is not entirely secure. And it's when that happens, if it ever happens, that we're going to have to face a reckoning on these questions.
Jamie, I'm with you on that because of the projections that we just saw from Greg, the debt service component, which will rise with rising interest rates, which look like, unless the economy craps out, we're going to have rising interest rates for the duration of this expansion. That means the debt service as a percentage of GDP goes up. With the growth numbers that I talk about, if we get those, that might offset it some. But no, the debt service goes up. We haven't solved the mandatory spending problem. We're not dealing with it at all. And we have Build Back Better, as wonderful as it is societally. I'm for so much of what's there societally. We're due for that. But that is a budget buster. What happens? You look at the.
I guess, Alan, on the question of the Yeah, on the question of what's going to happen to interest rates, I mean, I think we've seen this for years, that the Fed sits there and it looks at the possibility of raising them and talks about it. And then it says, gee, you know, the long-term rate's so low, raise the short-term rate, we're going to invert the yield curve. There's chaos. It's going to happen somewhere. Emerging markets, stock markets, corporate CLOs, I don't know where, but it will hit. And so they say, we better not do it. And this has been the pattern. And why they sustain these expansions on credit expansions for so long is because the consequences of not doing it are scary. So my bet is that they don't. And then it just goes on. So this has been the CBOs for years. This is like the little crack I made about Greg's comment about who believes the CBO. They for years have the interest rates reverting to 3-4%, and they never have. And as a result, those debt service numbers stay down where you showed that they are. They don't go up because I mean, we can talk about these problems, but they don't emerge because the Fed doesn't act the way it's expected to act.
I wouldn't put too much money on that view, because we had long bull market in bonds. The stuff that's behind it now, where we are at, is the stuff of the 80s and the stuff of the 60s. Those are really big growth rates, and they are also the stuff of 2003 to 2006. Where the system was very overextended because of the housing bubble, Greg, and all the crap that was levered on that. It was like a house of cards, and when it collapsed, everything collapsed. The system is in much better shape now, but it's not like the fiscal and monetary policy of the last 20 years. It's a totally different kettle of fish. And that's $7 trillion, even if most of its transfers will go somewhere. It'll go to the state and local government. And households eventually will do something with those transfers or save enough money so they can spend on other stuff. It's an awful lot of stimulus underneath, the likes of which we have not seen for decades.
There's a lot of pent-up demand, and then supply is shrinking with the Great Resignation, which hasn't come up in this conversation. A lot of people have retired during the pandemic. I doubt they're going to come back from retirement once they've retired. So I think that I think the scenario that scares me the most is that the Fed is very slow to raise rates because precisely because of the debt service, that Congress is going to say, gosh, Powell, if you raise rates, our budget's going to be out of whack. And so he's going to be very reluctant. And we're going to get the inflation coming back, basically because monetary policy is being driven more by fiscal concerns than by monetary concerns.
Hi, I'm Albert Keidel. I just wondered, is there any chance that that there's a political mood on the Fed? That do they want a collapse before 2024? And my more serious economic question was, to what degree is all the imports of consumer goods that are manufactured soaking up some of this demand so that it's all focused on services and assets, particularly housing, so that we're not getting a clear picture of the pass-through from the demand to the labor market?
Yes, there's been a very big shift in the composition of consumer spending away from certain services towards others. People, big demand for housing, less demand for in-person services. Goods demand has gone way up, which is one of the reasons we have the supply chain problems, because people are buying more goods relative to services.
It just occurs to me that since some of the minutes from the Fed in the 1990s through to now, from the Mexican manufacturing boom, once NAFTA went through, that they were waiting for the hit on the labor market of all the money they were creating and that the system, the leveraging in the 1990s was creating, and it wasn't happening, and they were very curious about that. And so then it seemed to me that continues if we keep looking for an inflationary impact through the labor market from the consumer demand boom, from all of the stimulus, it's tricky to read, I would think.
There's a very close association. There's a paper by a guy named Daniel Thompson was just published in Structural Change and Economic Dynamics, showing that all across the world, the rise in these very, what we call stagnant services, basically personal services, is associated with a decline in measured inflation. Why? Because, those, first of all, those wages don't rise. And secondly, if they ever do, it's counted as a quality improvement. It's a price increase, so that you just don't have the same share of the economy being driven by measurable differences between the quantity that's consumed and the price that can be distinguished the way it was true in the 50s and 60s and 70s. Makes me another, that's another sort of argument for team transitory on this. Once you're not going to see another 50% increase in the gas price. In fact, it's already come down. So that's going to show up in over time as a stabilizing factor.
Any comment on my political question about, is there a preference for stability?
Yeah, it's partly a judgment on the chair of the Federal Reserve and the person. And I do study that a lot. This is just an opinion. I do think he so far he's done whatever he said. He's been transparent, he's been honest, he's been ahead of time announcing things. He follows the data. He follows the science. He's not an economist. It's very interesting. He's a non-economist. He's extremely clear, I think, which is an advantage that non-economists have over economists, especially when they testify before Congress. But I view him as a very honest guy. So when he says he follows the data, that has helped me in advising people and in funds management, because he does follow the data. And what did he do? He delivered what was called a pivot on the data, because the inflation was out of hand, too high. And he told us, we got more than we wanted. We've achieved price stability. We still have room to go to get to full employment. And what's full employment? Well, he must think it's something like 3.5%, because that's the pre-pandemic number, which is in the range of the full employment unemployment rate by anybody's measure in history, including the natural rate type people over cycles. And then he adds to it a reaching down qualitative dimension with 8 or 9 items. That last employment report on Friday, guess what? 3.9, which is pretty close to 3.5. And those demographic, he can't now say that we have that far to go as an honest comment on the data. He has to say, and he's testifying this week on his confirmation. Now, will he talk ahead of the meeting? He's been very careful up till this last November 30 change, where he led his colleagues and front ran them. First time I think he had done it, but he gave his opinion. And so in the markets, on a short run basis, they're all scared of what he might say, because if he follows the data, and I believe he will follow the data, he'll be honest. So I don't think what you say is going to deter this guy. He stood up to Trump, who beat him up all over the place. He's going to stand up to Biden. And he said, it's not my job. I don't comment on it, colleagues. He just is consistent. Now, how much can a human being go back on what they say? Donald Trump was a total liar, pathological liar. He's a destructive narcissist.